Alright, gang, things just continue to get better and better, I guess. I just finished up the Toyota Camry suspension and dropped off that car, and the family asked me to check on the noise on their 96 Dodge work truck. So I drove it to my house. Any guess? Yeah, I'm saying the brakes are completely shot, and the rotor probably needs replaced. So that's next on the agenda. Well, I've jacked it up, taken off the wheel. In this case, the lug nuts were a 19mm, and you can look at the pad and realize that there is no pad left. It's just a plate, and the back of this rotor feels pretty rough, so I'm probably going to have to replace it. The calipers held on with 2 bolts, like most calipers, and I used a 3/8 Allen head shape socket. I believe it's actually a 9mm, but I didn't have one, and this one fit pretty close and was able to get it loose. So once the bolts are retracted out as far as I could get them, I can take a screwdriver and put up here and move the caliper out of the way. And yeah, there you can see the what's left of that pad. Metal to metal is never good. Let me see if I can get a look at the back of the rotor. I can't see it in the camera, but you can. But I'm pretty sure it's toast. So I'll check into getting a new rotor and a new set of pads and bearings and take care of this. Well, I got a little ahead of myself and I pulled the rotor off without showing you all the details, but basically this little dust cap right here goes on the outside of the rotor, and you can wedge a screwdriver in behind it and pop it off. Inside you'll find some pieces, parts. This would actually go against the wheel bearing. That's the lock nut that threads onto the end of the shaft here. It holds everything in place. And then you have a little castellated nut. They call that because it looks like a little castle. And then the cotter pin. And I'll show you those when I put it back together. But I pulled everything apart, and you can see all the debris accumulated there in that little valley from what's left of the rotor and the pad. And so after pulling the rotor off, now you can really see how bad this thing's chewed up, and I didn't feel like there was any possibility of turning it, and I wouldn't do that anyway. I would just go ahead and get a new one. So I did get a new one, and it has all the ring on it for the ABS, just like that one has. And of course these, you probably may know or may not know, I don't know, but rotors come with the race, as they call it, for the wheel bearings already in place on the inside and on the outside, and that's a tapered bearing. Now normally I would buy new bearings and repack them and put them in. I'm trying to do this on a little more of a budget, so I didn't buy the new bearings after talking it over with the mechanic that I know at the parts store, and he suggested, as it's been done before, people have cleaned up bearings and reused them, and he suggested doing that, and as long as there's no pitting or anything, it'll be fine. And I'm pretty happy with that decision. These bearings look great. I cleaned them up, and I see no issue with reusing these. So the next step I'm going to do is pack these bearings full of grease so that I can get them in place, and then once I get the inner bearing in, I'll put the seal, you could call it a dust seal or a bearing seal, and that'll go on top of the bearing and hold everything in and keep debris from gathering inside. So that'll be the next step, is to pack the bearings and get them installed. Now, I've shown this before in another video. I have one of these packing tools, and basically you take this top part off, slip the wheel bearing on, thread this back down, put your grease gun on the Zerk fitting, and just pump it. I've had good luck with these in the past, but my grease gun is pretty low on grease. So I started to fill this one, and you can see where it was pushing through and coming out around the rollers. But what I'm going to do is show you another technique, and I've shown this in other videos, and this is the hand technique. And the idea is that you want to pack grease into the space here between the inner assembly and the outer assembly and then the rollers, and it needs to fill all that space. So the way to do that is to get grease, and I will say this, wear gloves because this stuff is bad for you, and you're just going to make a sweeping motion into your palm, and as you do that it'll compress the grease up into those areas, and you can just see it now. It's coming out right there. Hopefully you can see that. So that's how you pack a wheel bearing, and I'll just go around and round and just keep grabbing a little bit at a time and pack it up in there. There you can see a little bit more maybe. Pretty simple, but a lot of people probably don't know how to do this. I've heard of people just rubbing grease on the outside and thinking that was all you needed to do, and that's not how it works. So I'll keep packing this one and then get it installed. Okay, I packed it in on both sides, that direction in that gap, and also on the back side in that gap, and then I made sure it was fully filled and put coating on top, and then I also put grease down inside the race, so plenty of lubrication in there now. The next part I'm going to show you is installing this little seal. Now this can be tricky sometimes. The seal is going to go with the opening in. The rubber is going to go against the rotor, the spindle assembly. This gasket right here will go against the spindle to seal it off. So sometimes it takes a little effort to get these in. And if you're lucky, you get it in the first shot. And all I'm trying to do is make this flush with this shiny part right here on the face of the rotor. And you can hear it, it sounds like I'm hitting the rotor, which I am. That means that thing is now flush. So now I'll install this back onto the truck. Okay, as you can see, I've cleaned up all the grit and grime that was on or near the shaft. And now I'll take the new assembly, slip it up on there, and you can see I've already put some grease inside of the bearing race for the outer bearing. I'll make sure there's no debris that got caught up in the grease. Don't want anything getting in the bearing itself. Once that's in place, my well greased outer bearing, slip that up there, and then I'll install the remaining pieces. Now, as I said before, there's a flat piece, and it has a tang on it, and that lines up in that groove on the shaft. So that's that. And then we have the retaining nut. That'll thread on. And then it doesn't really take much from there to make this fit right, because they are tapered bearings, so they will need to be snug, but you can rotate it and see that nut turn a little more. That's because the bearings are starting to seat in to the races more. Right. Do some adjustment there, and then I'm just using a little pair of vice grips. I'll put a little bit of tension on, rotate it, and that's really it. You don't want to do a whole lot You just want to have enough tension, and then so that the rotor itself doesn't wiggle, you know, and then that'll keep it from vibrating as you go down the road. The next thing I'm going to do is install the little castellated nut that I talked about, and I'm going to line that up. There's a hole up and down in the shaft, so I want to line up some of these teeth so that that hole corresponds, and then I'll take the cotter pin, snake it in there. Oop. Bring that out the other side, and then I'll spread that apart, and basically that'll keep that nut from turning. And then of course the last part, we'll be putting the dust cap on. And that is all it takes to put the rotor on. Okay, the next thing I'm going to do is remove this outer brake pad that is obviously no good, so I can make some room for the new ones. You can see just how bad those things are. And then the inner one I'm going to leave in place for a minute because I need to compress the piston back into the caliper. And I'm going to compress the piston with this tool. And this is something I picked up a good while ago. You probably saw it in another video. This just has AC Delco brand name on it, but it was only like 10 bucks or something, and it served me well. So I'll use it to compress the piston. And I'll just go slow. And I've said it in other videos, and I'll say it in this one as well. When you're doing this, you should check the fluid in the reservoir at the master cylinder, because it may compress the fluid, and it will compress the fluid back in to the reservoir. But if somebody has serviced it recently, you could be pushing fluid out of the master cylinder and all over the place. I've already checked it. I know this vehicle, it's a little low to begin with, so I can just compress this one. I'll finish doing that, and then I'll get the other pads in. Okay, so I've compressed that in. I've changed my angle a little bit here, but I'm going to come in behind like this and push this inner brake pad out of the way, and that's just scary bad. I am using pads that are Wherever Platinums from Advanced Auto Parts. And these are professional, says so on the packaging, but they wrap each and every one of the pads in their own little wrapper. So now what I'm going to do is take this pad and line it up, and it takes, you have to push this in a little with your thumb, but that's all it takes to get that pad in place. And then the outer pad has these retainers as well. And may take a little effort to slip that over, but there it is. So now the pad's in place. The other thing I did, or I'm going to do, is I'm going to lubricate the bolts. Now these have a sleeve around them, but this part still has to slide. So I'll put some grease on there that came in the kit, and that'll help these as the pads wear down, the caliper can move on the rotor. Okay, now that I've got the pads in place, and I use some of the grease provided with the brake pads on the sleeves for the bolts, I'll probably put a little bit of grease just on this contact area right here. It won't hurt anything to have a little bit of lubrication on that. And then I'll install the caliper back in place. Slip it over the rotor. and then it's just a matter of lining up the bolt threads and tightening everything up, and that's it. Pretty simple. And thanks for watching.